Hi, I'm William Rains with the From Green to Gray virtual art exhibition. Today I'm being joined by Dr. Kristina Dahl with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Hi, Kristina.
Hi, William. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us. Would you mind giving us a little bit of background into the work you do with the Union of Concerned Scientists?
Sure. So, my job title is Senior Climate Scientist. And in that role, I do a lot of different things for the Union of Concerned Scientists. One of my primary jobs is to design and execute research projects that help to illuminate the kinds of climate impacts communities around the US are going to see as a result of climate change. But I also do a lot of communications work. So I write for our blog, I write reports about the findings of our research. I'll talk to reporters about issues that are coming up related to climate change in the news. So it's a real range of research and writing and communications.
Awesome. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right into the questions.
Sure.
Great. So a lot of people attempt to address climate concerns through personal action, whether that be by recycling more often, using less plastic, etc. What is the effectiveness of this method and how does it differ from the implementation of effective climate policy?
So individual actions are definitely important, and we should all be thinking about our carbon footprint and the resources that we are using. That can't be a substitute, though, for federal action on climate change. We really need leadership from governments here in the US and around the world so that we have access as personal citizens to the sorts of choices that we need to be making in order to reduce our carbon intensity of our lifestyles. So just as an example of that, an individual, someone who's going to buy a new car can choose to buy an electric vehicle, right? But that's not always an affordable choice for everyone. And so even if someone really wants to do the thing that's great for the earth and buy the electric vehicle, they can't always afford to do that. And that's where government programs can really lead. So the government can say, we're going to provide huge incentives for car makers to make new and affordable electric vehicles. We are going to provide rebates on your tax returns if you buy an electric vehicle. And so all of those incentives make it easier for us as individuals to make the kinds of choices that we want to make for the environment. So it is important, and I would encourage everyone to continue doing things individually, whether it's reducing the amount of plastic you're using or biking or walking to work or school instead of driving. Those are all great. And it's important to see those as well as part of a social change in our society where we're encouraging each other to be more mindful of the resources we're using. So I would say keep it up on the individual actions, but also keep pushing for that big federal legislation and state legislation that we need.
Great, thank you. And I guess along those lines, I wonder, as someone who works with policymakers to spread information about climate change and its effects, why haven't we seen effective climate policy coming from our governments in the past?
So climate policy is going to need to touch a lot of different aspects of our society. It's going to need to touch our electricity systems and our transportation systems, the ways that we choose building materials, all kinds of things. And so it's important to recognize that that's a complicated and huge ask of our policymakers. On the other hand, scientists have been saying for decades that we need to be cutting our carbon emissions, and otherwise we're going to be feeling the effects of that. The voices of those scientists and of the many concerned citizens in the US often compete with the voices of very deep-pocketed industry representatives. And I'm thinking in particular here of the fossil fuel industry, which has spent incredible sums of money fighting the sort of information that climate scientists have been trying to provide with their own disinformation. And those fossil fuel companies have a very powerful lobbying voice in Washington, D.C. with our policymakers. And there are many in our government who listen to those voices, who have been saying climate change is not a problem, humans haven't been causing it, We need to continue to drill for oil and burn gas. So there's been a real effort by the fossil fuel industry to prevent effective climate policies from getting passed. And hopefully we're starting to see some people coming around who haven't been receptive to the climate science in the past, but it has been a real challenge over the last few decades.
Yeah, and you kind of touched upon how climate policy is going to affect many different areas, being transportation, um, energy. I guess I wonder, a lot of people are concerned about climate policy, specifically as it relates to our economy and how our economy will adapt to green energy. What would you say to people who are concerned for our economy?
Yeah, I would say that there is going to be change, right, in how we get our energy and the types of jobs that people will be doing specifically related to the energy industry. We've seen coal jobs falling and plummeting in numbers over the last decade or so. And that's really being driven by the fact that coal is no longer as cost effective as building a new solar facility, for example. So as the cost of renewables has come down, we've seen a decline in the number of coal jobs specifically. But that doesn't mean that there aren't new jobs in greener industries like solar and wind. And so as we're thinking about how we transition to a cleaner energy economy, it's really important to recognize that for decades, people in the oil and gas and coal industry have been powering our society. We have all benefited from the work, and it's often dangerous work, that people in the fossil fuel industry have been doing. And so it's very important that we think about how we transition those jobs in a fair way for those people who can potentially help us still provide energy for our country in cleaner and greener ways. I would also say that investing in the sorts of adaptations that make our communities and our infrastructure more resilient to climate change really pays off in the end. So there have been studies that have shown that for every dollar that's invested in kind of improving the resilience of our infrastructure, we save $6 or $7 down the line in terms of damage costs. So it really does pay to put some money into this now so that we don't suffer when we experience things like major hurricanes or major wildfires. So really investing now is an investment in our future.
Yeah, great. Along those lines, you were discussing, workers and the importance of their contribution. I think of your report, Killer Heat, in which you talk about agricultural workers and some of the effects that will happen to the agriculture industry as a result of climate change. But along those lines, I also think about within Killer Heat, you talk about three different climate responses being no action, slow action, and rapid action. Say we don't adapt our economy or change our policies, what is the likelihood that we'll see rapid action or even like slow action if we don't adapt to that?
Yeah, so if we don't make any changes in the ways that we're getting our electricity, the ways that we're traveling, we'll continue to see our greenhouse gas emissions, those are carbon dioxide and other gases that warm our atmosphere, we'll continue to see those emissions rise throughout the century. And the consequences of that would be devastating. We're talking about parts of our country becoming unlivable because they're underwater because of sea level rise, or parts of our country effectively being unlivable because they're so hot, having a level of heat that most places on Earth don't experience today. So it's really critical that we start to bring those emissions down. And if we do that, we can really slow the pace of a lot of the changes that we as climate scientists project in our climate models. And it's not something that the US can do on its own, but given that the United States has been such a large emitter of greenhouse gases over the course of our history, we really have to be thinking about and being mindful of what our fair share is when we're looking at global emissions reductions.
Great, thank you. And along those lines, I'm wondering, say we don't adapt our climate policy, what communities internationally or nationally will we see affected the worst by climate change?
So as is the case in many instances, it's often low-income communities and communities of color who will find themselves on the front lines of climate change. That's already the case, both here in the US and around the world, but will become even more so in the future. So one example you can look at is Southern Louisiana. This is home to a lot of Black people and a lot of Indigenous people, and it has some of the fastest rates of sea level rise in the country. So we have communities there that are just swamped with every high tide. And many of the people who can afford to leave that area have already done so. And the people who are left are those who are unable to afford to pick up and move, whether it's the cost of housing or the inability to find a job in a new place. So over and over again, we see that it is the folks who have been dealing with the consequences of climate change already for a long time, who will continue to feel those effects most acutely. And just by nature of the fact that in our country, there has been centuries of systemic racism, it's most frequently people of color and people with low incomes who will feel those changes most acutely.
Yeah, and along those lines, I think of the importance of intersectional activism and climate justice. My final question for you would be, what does effective climate advocacy look like from a scientific perspective?
So effective climate advocacy has a few really critical parts. One is that it's science-based. So we need to be taking into account the latest climate projections, the historical trends that we've observed, really the latest scientific findings to say, this is what we need for our country. This is what we need for our world. And the evidence is all pointing to needing to reduce our emissions very drastically, hopefully by about 50% within the next 10 years or so to put us on a safe path. But another really critical component of climate advocacy is recognizing the potential for climate action to benefit communities who have long suffered from the consequences of our pollution and our housing policies and the racism in our country. So we need to be taking cues from communities that have been suffering for a long time with things like extreme heat or flooding, and asking them, what is it that you need, and how can we be designing policies that certainly don't exacerbate or worsen the problems that you've already been experiencing, but actually make them better. And it's very similar to how the economic recovery from COVID could go, right? We could build back to how we have been, or we can build back better and make sure that people have more access to healthcare, more access to daycare, more access to equitable schools. So the same sort of notion that we're talking about in terms of recovery from COVID is how we can frame our future climate policies, really aiming to improve the quality of life for everyone, while also making sure that it's a higher quality of life for our children and grandchildren.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. There will be more resources available after this video. Thank you.